Thanks for joining us today, Professor Greg Barton. How are you?
Oh, good. Thanks. Good to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
You're our first international guest, technically calling in from Indonesia. Whereabouts are you today?
I'm at the station in Bandung on my way to Jakarta in a little while, but I'm living based in Bandung because Deakin University has a new campus in Bandung, so I'm heading up the academic program at that campus.
Well, let's get stuck into it. You're obviously, an expert in the Salafi jihadi sort of extremist world, and you've sort of seen the landscape of extremism in the West shift over the decades, evolved from mostly Islamic kind of fundamentalism to more diverse political ideologies such as far right nationalism. I'd just like to just get from you how you think extremism in the West has kind of shifted since the global war on terror.
Yeah, I think the first point to make, Joel, which is not immediately obvious, is that you hear the stories of recruitment to far right extremism, people joining a neo-Nazi group, and the pathway that people get recruited to a group like Al Qaeda, Islamic State, or other Salafi jihadi groups. And you see, invariably the same elements. Somebody is lonely. It's a social process that somebody comes along and they sense they have a new friend. They sense a new sense of belonging, a new community. And from that, normally the community becomes first and then they internalize the ideas. So, of course, ideas for the far right are different from the ideas of Salafi jihadism, although there's many common elements. But a big point of distinction is that if somebody joins a group like Al Qaeda or Islamic State, they generally are required to swear an oath of allegiance, and it can have aspects of a cult-like engagement in that they've sort of got a strong loyalty to a particular leader, Amir, and a particular group, and that's one of the reasons we've seen fights between Islamic State and Al Qaeda, even though they came out of the same Al Qaeda in Iraq origin. That strong allegiance with the organization is really critical. Whereas in the far right, what we see is some people join a movement, but in Australia, that's not large numbers that join sort of National Socialist Network or something, or other such groups. But many more people are online, engaged in chat forums. The chat forums have a particular culture which is different from jihadi chat forums. So in the far right space, there's a lot of what's referred to as shit posting, so a lot of dark humor that is ambiguous. And then when somebody's called up and challenged on something they've said, they said, "Oh, it was just a joke. I'm not being serious." And that makes it hard for law enforcement and others to figure out, what level of threat they represent, if any level of threat, what their intention is. The classic example is of the Christchurch terrorist from New South Wales, an Australian who had been on forums, had visited people in Europe, far right extremists, but on forums, shit posting, engaging, and then suddenly goes from doing that sort of stuff, which seems it's pretty common. So it's not doesn't seem very consequential to sort of taking AR-15s and shooting people dead in Friday of prayer, very cold-blooded mass murder. And spotting that connection is, when somebody makes that transition from just posting stuff online to acting is really hard to spot. They generally go and act if they're far right motivation as a lone actor. They do it in their own name. They often will upload a manifesto, often live stream the event if they can. They're clearly playing to an audience. So they are very much a social, creature because they think that their audience, their community, they have a hunger for their praise. They tend also, incidentally, not to be really keen on martyrdom. So very common with far right extremists to be arrested after the attack. And we saw with the July 2011 Norway attacks by Anders Behring Breivik. Yeah, he made a real nuisance of himself in the courtroom by grandstanding. And we saw the same thing in Christchurch as well. So these are narcissistic individuals who not keen on dying for their cause, but want to be seen as heroes. And they want their community to say that they've gone from zero to hero.
Is there a utility there, though, in potentially, some of these actors staying alive, being arrested, for them to project their manifesto as well? I mean, if martyrdom did have a greater impact, a perceived impact, could that be an option as well? Or are you saying there is just more of a a lack of commitment. I mean, after something like Christchurch, uh, anything's possible, I suppose, for the attacker. So
Yes. Yeah, we've had a lot of the Christchurch attack was extreme, certainly the worst Australian terrorist incident. Um, but it does follow a pattern. It follows that 2011, July 2011 pattern in Norway, in Oslo, in the Toy Island. We've had many attacks in the intervening years. There were attacks immediately after Christchurch that directly referenced Christchurch. And the pattern tends to be similar. Somebody often nowadays using assault weapons, um, and live streaming if they can, posting a manifesto beforehand, and then grandstanding after the arrest. Whether they believe it's more efficacious to survive and then proclaim their message than to die a martyr is not clear. They do use the language of martyrdom, but you see with people in Islamic State and al-Qaeda and other Salafi jihadi groups, very clearly, there are many cases of somebody being radicalized and recruited for a suicide mission over a very short period of time. And it would seem that they're coming out of a cultural milieu and a point of conviction for the individual where they truly believe that their death in the suicide mission, which they see as a martyrdom operation, is literally a gateway to paradise, that they're going from this plane of existence to another plane of existence that's infinitely better. And so that sense of fear of death or lack of certainty is typically not present in those Salafi jihadi terrorists who are prepared to die. Whereas for the far right extremists, not entirely clear what their worldview is in terms of life after death, but they don't seem particularly confident to try it immediately.
I want to sort of see if there's any sort of connection between all extremists, but between particular these Salafi Wahhabi groups and the far right. As far as in, I want to reference there was a recent leak from 4chan, from that channel that everyone shit posts on, where they found that there was a large, like an over amount of traffic and creators on this forum that were based in Israel and the United
Yes.
States. Um, perhaps proving that potentially some of the shit posting is being generated in a certain area. And there's also links between, the rise of al-Jolani, which I want to get into a bit later on. There's
Sure.
been a bit of a legitimization of these Wahhabi Salafi groups within the operational theaters of the Middle East. And I was just wondering if there is like a deep state or a sort of state based factor that's contributing to this sort of global extremism on all sides.
Yeah, it's the devil's in the detail with that, Joel. So it's not generally the case that we have a deep state factor, but and we say the word deep state, we think of sort of conspiracy theory, and conspiracy theories are normally not shown to be good explanations for why things happen. But that doesn't mean that there aren't ever sort of deeper layers of state control, and particularly when it comes to intelligence agencies and nefarious intent. So I think the classic example, and it's not unique, is the Inter-Services Intelligence Agency of Pakistan, ISI in Pakistan. They have had the view for decades that they could run extremists as sort of proxies, and they could manipulate them and manage them. And generally, I think, long story short, with Pakistan, particularly the last 3 years, which have been tragically violent, is that ISI and other groups that you could say they're literally deep within the state, operating out of sight by and large. So if there is a deep state, something like ISI is deep state. And in Iran, the Revolutionary Guards Corps is hardly a secret, but that is clearly out in the open deep state. So that concept has some validity. Those
Is it,
operations in
sorry,
yeah.
I just want to, like, the ISI kind of learned its trade from the British. And the use of extreme Muslim groups and fighters within regions across the colonial sort of history has been a factor here. So is there a sort of link that goes beyond Iran and Pakistan into the wider kind of colonial kind of experience that sort of pushes towards harnessing an extremist factor to achieve geopolitical aims?
Yeah, I don't think it's a consistent and sort of linear link, but there are threads that run through history. So if you look at colonial history, there have always been colonial officers who have, a typical policy position was to divide and conquer, of course. And there were always some individuals who were particularly Machiavellian in the way they would recruit relationships, tribal relationships, and divide and conquer and manipulate. I think in sort of more recent periods, say in the post-war period, it's true that there's intelligence exchange with all intelligence agencies around the world to some extent, at least those who are not enemies. So Cold War partners may have had back channel communications, but they didn't cooperate except for avoiding a common threat. So to the extent that ISI officials had links with British intelligence, I don't think their decision to try and run a group like Lashkar-e-Toiba, for example, was something that came from the British side. I think it was just it's coming out of the context in which they operate, and complex when some members of ISI become more and more ideologically convinced themselves. So I think a change in decades in the Pakistani military that started out as a very secular elite and ended up becoming an elite part of Pakistani society in which religious conviction was important for some in ways that made this process harder to manage because there were different loyalties. I think there's no question that if you talk about British or American intelligence, along with surveillance and sort of data collection, often through human sources, which therefore is about human relationship cultivation, there are black operations. There are operations either using information warfare or assassination, and that's been part of the world of intelligence for a very long time. We've seen this recently in Iran, where it was clear that Mossad had spectacular tactical success penetrating the layers of the Iranian security defense community, and managed to have access to information, but also bring in weaponry and launch attacks from inside even the capital Tehran in a way that's quite remarkable. We saw a different penetration of Hezbollah. The success with the pager attack involved in penetrating the supply lines. So tactically, you have to say brilliant stuff. And that black operations element has always been there in the world of intelligence. It's a lesser, a more minor part. I mean, it features more prominently in Hollywood, of course, but it's actually not the major part. But it is there. And when it comes to working in areas of the world where there's maybe religious extremism or extremism linked to nationalism, whatever, there's the temptation to try and exploit various extremist leaders, charismatic leaders, and think you can somehow co-opt them or control them or at least use them instrumentally. And that's, often deeply mistaken.
It's interesting that you say that. I just finished up watching a lecture from a bloke called Roy Casagranda, a Texan University fella, professor there, and he was remarking on something quite sort of, I was unaware of how important that Iranian-US link was under the Shah, where the CIA operations for the entire Asia were based out of Tehran, and there was also one of the four mints in America were based out of Tehran to print $20 bills for CIA operations. Now, an interesting point I just wanted to get to from here was that after the Islamic Revolution, and after the CIA essentially lost its complete and utter remit in Asia and was exposed and had to essentially rebuild. And I think the ire, of Washington and Tehran is somewhat based around that heartbroken relationship regarding that sort of compromised operation, where it had to be built from the basement again, and probably never reached its zenith since. But the one remark that he made there was that, with Tehran, when it fell, there were two groups competing for power. And that was the socialists, the communists, and the Islamic Republic, essentially, which came through the Islamists. So America did side with the Islamists to try and check and mitigate Russia's expanse. The last thing they wanted was the Soviet Iran on Russia's border. Now, just sort of going back to this again, through the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and through the operations in Syria we're seeing recently, there seems to be a quite an intimate connection, even from al-Nusra and the formation of some of these groups under the Obama wing. Is there a sort of linear line here that we can look at that does demonstrate that kind of post-war effort of the West to try and contain and mitigate communist governments and democracies growing up in the Middle East? Is there some evidence that sees a continuity of history that can be sort of criticized here?
Yeah, I'm not sure I would state the question quite like that, but I think the first thing to say up front is that we should be always skeptical of singular explanations that this was all a British plot or this was all the CIA. Life is seldom so simple. And I think if you spoke to people inside the CIA, they would say that some of the imagined projections of things that they've done or capabilities they have are way beyond anything because they are an American bureaucracy. Complicated, interesting organization, but they have all the weaknesses of Western bureaucracies and organizations. So they're not omnipotent, obviously, nor are they omniscient. And
they have a black budget, though.
Yeah, look, and of course they have a long history of running black operations, and they are very resourceful, and they do run human sources, and they have very dedicated people, but they're not magicians, right? So some of the things that are ascribed as American, based conspiracy theory, basically fall at the first hurdle when it comes to testing the plausibility, because they imagine a level of competency and the ability to keep secrets, which is often at odds with the reality. But to go back to your point, through the Cold War, there are a lot of operations designed to check the advance of the Soviet bloc. And so there were in Latin America assassinations and manipulations. Sometimes it was purely motivated by desire to check the Soviets. Sometimes it was just sort of more venal motivations, oil and gas interests dressed up as defending Western society, but actually really quite venal and self-serving. But the experience of supporting the Mujahideen, as they were called, in repelling the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the 1980s, I think was a steep learning curve. And I think one of the biggest mistakes made engaging with the Mujahideen was not staying on in Afghanistan to help rebuild Afghan society. So, of course, by 1996, the Taliban are taking control of Afghanistan, and that pattern has been there for decades now, and very tragic consequences. And there was an opportunity. I think there was a reason for working with Mujahideen groups to oppose the Soviets. But if there was a moral argument to be made, as well as a practical self-serving argument of the Western interests, it would be, and we saw this point in the novel and the film Charlie Wilson's War, that we need to stay on and keep the relationship going and help a nation that has suffered the worst ravages of war and will naturally blame Western interests. I mean, for very logical reasons, even if it was Russian or other interests that had caused the destruction. So from a self-serving Western point of view and from a moral point of view, we should have stayed through in Afghanistan through the 1990s, and then likely Al-Qaeda never would have the opportunity to put its footprint in. After we went back after the 2001 Al-Qaeda attacks, we should have, I think, focused on pushing the Taliban out of power and helping build something better in Afghanistan. And of course, 20 years later, we should never have left Afghanistan the way that we did. So there's all of those things have a common thread of short-term thinking and sort of siloed mentalities and different competing interests in government agencies and politics, with really tragic and amoral consequences, but also consequences that are against our own best interests. And the Islamic Revolution in Iran in '79 has all those elements. Quite possibly, if there had not been the 8-year war between Iraq and Iran, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps wouldn't have consolidated their power in the way that they did. But that has been such a tragic consequence for the people of Iran. This has been such a brutal mafia state mixed with religious zealotry that's the worst of all possible worlds. That's caused so much misery. So there are reasons to be concerned about the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps regime in Iran. Of course, the question is, how do we respond And there's this recent history of, I mean, there's definitely been an ambition to build nuclear weapons. Quite logical when you look at other countries' experience. When Muammar Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program, he literally didn't live too much longer. Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang and North Korea are sort of living more or less happily as venal elites because they've got a nuclear weapons program. They can act in the most provocative fashion, and we're reluctant to sort of risk interrupting that because we fear the consequences. So one of the dangers at the moment is that the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps in Tehran will rush to try and complete a nuclear program. But clearly they were involved in the program. It was, and it continues to be a threat. So when somebody like Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, cries wolf, and as he has done for more than 30 years, as in the fable of the boy who cried wolf, there actually are wolves in the forest, and there's a real threat. Just a question of the credibility of those calls being damaged by what seemed to be a politician with his own interests. Another more complicated story, but yeah, there are no simple sort of shades of black and white here. It's mostly a murky world, and there are a lot of principled people who are trying to do the right thing, often at great personal cost. So Western intelligence agency agents, Iranians, Israelis, there are many. If we knew their story, people who would say we're heroes, but the whole business that they're involved in is a murky business.
We could also argue that the Iranian regime has ebbed and flowed, or the projection or the experience has ebbed and flowed due to perceived pressures from the West. I mean, we knew when September 11 happened that the Iranian government reached out to Washington as one of the first ports of call, offered to provide the teledex to the Northern Alliance, essentially, and helped America in that early war. Then it was only after Richard Pearl's clean break memo became codified in that axis of evil speech where Iran was kind of thrown around. There's also another period in the 90s where there was quite a bit of a thawing between Iran and Bill Clinton, right? Where, essentially that, what I'm trying to get at is it feels like Iran's always been pushing towards that Mossadegh moment. Even under the Islamic Republic, it wants to find this peaceful place to sit, and then it sort of gets the hornet's nest kicked over in front of it every few years or so at the moment. That's a factor that comes into play. But look, I want to just sort of transition to like the actual real-time example of this right now. You got Abu Mohammad al-Jolani, who's essentially an ISIS person who's come into Syria and overthrown the Assad regime. And then we've seen this media spin, which has sort of brought this person to a suit, shaking hands with women, a couple of other aspects. Whereas behind the scenes in Syria, there are some pretty terrifying reprisals happening that were, no less or more brutal as the Assad regime, but they definitely got their own flavor of suppressing minorities, of suppressing Christians. So I want to point towards, is this Jolani example, is this the West legitimizing or engaging with these ISIS-related groups in a more overt and legitimate way, and changing the nature of what these people are in the perceptions of the West?
Yeah, really good questions, Joel. I don't know that we've got enough time to get into it. I've got to leave in 15 minutes, but I'll do my best to unpack. Let's look at the Jolani story first of all. So the context is really important to understand. One of the justifications for invading Iraq in 2003 was, obviously weapons of mass destruction was the trope that was used, but more sophisticated reasoning was that this could open the way for al-Qaeda if Saddam remains in power. Ironically, by invading in the way that was done, relying overly on technology, shock and awe, not having enough troops on the ground so that when American allied forces went in, they couldn't guard munitions dumps, they couldn't guard water purification stations, they couldn't guard other vital infrastructure. It left a power vacuum. It was compounded by the fact that they took a policy of de-Baathification of anyone who had links with the former Baath Party regime of Saddam Hussein was pushed aside. So you lost most of the sort of middle upper ranks of technocrats, but also senior military officers, and many of them turned understandably towards insurgent groups. And the group that came to dominate was al-Qaeda in Iraq. And al-Qaeda in Iraq changed its name to become Islamic State in Iraq. And they saw with the 2011 Arab Spring protest an opportunity to join with movements that were opposing the Shah's regime to sort of expand their operation from Iraq to Iran. And the guy they dispatched was the guy whose nom de guerre was al-Jolani from the Golan Heights, from that region of southern part of Syria. So a Syrian who was a genuine believer in al-Qaeda ideas, and somebody who felt a strong sense of allegiance. I mentioned earlier, swearing of bias, swearing oath of loyalty. He felt an allegiance to the leadership of al-Qaeda, and he was dispatched to set up operations ahead of a unification of what he was doing in Syria with what was going on with the Islamic State in Iraq, and this was to become Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. He was unhappy with that sort of direction. He was unhappy with the leadership of Islamic State in Iraq doing things that were at odds with the al-Qaeda position. So it was a more extreme group, Islamic State. It was much more overt in its violence towards Shia communities, for example, than was al-Qaeda. And there are many other factors. And Jolani was also a nationalist. So he was a Syrian nationalist. He did care about his country. So in the end, he, under directions from the leadership of al-Qaeda, broke with the leadership of Islamic State. And then the two factions were at war. Islamic State did, of course, expand into Syria, but one of their opponents was always Jabhat al-Nusra, which was very much, even after it renamed, was a front for al-Qaeda. Went through some more complicated name changes, ended up as HTS. The link with al-Qaeda became less clear over time, but that was his historical link. So Jolani, Ahmad Ashara, as his real name is, and as he now goes by, was an individual who had been on that journey as an al-Qaeda true believer, as a Syrian nationalist who was opposed the typical regime in Damascus under Assad. It was a really cruel regime. He genuinely believed in those things. Now, the remarkable change we saw over the last 12 months has many people being skeptical. But my reading, and I'm not a Syrian expert, people who are Syrian experts and who follow jihadi communities, I think the consensus position is that there was a genuine change that went on with Jolani. It parallels a change that I'm more familiar with in Indonesia, where the leadership of Jemaah Islamiyah, a group affiliated with al-Qaeda historically, made a decision to disband their terrorist network and focus on their religious schools. And with Ahmad Ashara, Jolani, it seems like something similar is going on. So I just want to say I acknowledge the cynicism and the complexity and the need for skepticism. But it is possible for people, if people are driven by conviction, if they really have a strong belief that they're fighting for good, and we need to be open to understanding that conviction, because this is not mostly about people behaving badly because they're narcissists or because they're self-serving. It's people behaving because they, in the first instance, because it's their community. Secondly, because they really believe the narrative of their community. But it's possible that can change. They can at a certain point be persuaded, look, violence is not getting us what we want. In fact, we risk losing it all. If we're prepared to give up this one thing we thought was important, violence, then we can pursue the aims that are most important in different ways. And that, I think, long story short, is the story with Ahmad Ashara. Yeah, Syria is a nightmarish place in so many regards. It has a long history of sectarian conflict. The rapid fall of the Assad regime, the replacement by Ashara's group, even if he was an angel, he would not be able to control all those forces. He's clearly not an angel, but nor is he perhaps simply the devil that some would portray him as. It's a more complex story. But Syria's got just massive challenges. The level of impoverishment, the desperation, the sense of resentment between communities, all of these things, none of them are excusable, but they're understandable, and they need to be reckoned with to sort of make sense of what's going on. So it's a different story with Ahmad Ashara in Syria than it is with the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps in Tehran, who they're clearly dominated by hardliners, as the ranks of the regime in Kabul in Afghanistan, where the hardliners are in charge. Now, changing people's convictions, persuading them to do something differently is always possible. But when you have a hardline faction really in charge in a kind of police state setting, then it's naive to think we can just appeal to people to make choices and change. And of course, it's deeply naive and if not actually obscenely offensive to say to people of Iran, just rise up and overthrow the regime because they've been oppressed by a police state that's been ruthless. So we need to sort of
But we've
bear that in
also
mind.
seen, Greg, we've also seen after they were, extrajudicial killings, from the Hamas leader, from Soleimani, from
Yeah,
some of these attacks, which, as you said, were effective and great for Israel.
yeah,
But they have galvanized. I've seen feminists on the streets of Tehran, siding with the government now. There is a depth to that story. Whereas with
yes,
Jelani, I mean, we've got a civilization state in Persia versus a Sykes-Picot country that's been ripped apart, with these delineations and these ethnic groups that have sort of, it's like with Iraq, you need Baathism, you need Alawite power structures to control these like really bad sort of groupings of people along these delineations drawn with crayons. So my point
yeah,
being is, with someone like Jolani, who's running around with a force that, of Uyghur, Turkmen, mercenary fighters, jihadis that are running around as his top brass. And he's also handed over the Golan Heights without so much saying a thing. He's allowed Israel to destroy all their weapon stockpiles. And he's also spoken about marching into Gaza. So I just sort of want to ask about, just before we move on to a couple of other topics before you have to go, I just sort of wanted to ask is, Israel seems to be off the list of Jelani's enemies, even though Israel has been quite responsible for many of the instabilities in the region. Why is it that these ISIS affiliated fighters have never declared a jihad or a war or any kind of position of aggression towards Israel?
Al Qaeda historically was much more motivated by the Palestinian cause. Some of the key Al Qaeda leaders had a Palestinian background. Islamic State seemed to shift their focus more on Iran and the Shias and less on Israel per se. There are various layers to this, but to cut through to the present, I think one of the reasons that Ahmad Ashara is not taking issue with Israel is he's a realist. He knows the limits of what's possible. If he can survive, if his life is not cut short over the next couple of years, and his regime is not cut short, that will be a remarkable accomplishment, and it'll be an accomplishment in part because of realism. So um, there's a lot, there's hours and hours of conversation to be had about the way that Israel operates and the way that Mossad and other intelligence agencies operate, and then the morality of it. But it was very clear that they were able to penetrate deeply into Hezbollah, into Lebanese society, and at the moment was opportune, strike back at Hezbollah, and that their constant focus being trying to remove the proxies of Iran. And so in Syria, Iran had many proxy elements that were Shia militias that were enemies of Ashara's people. So you can sort of understand my enemy's enemy sort of logic, but also just taking on Israel. I mean, I think he probably correctly made the calculation. There's been a lot of belligerent voices against Ashara from the Israeli establishment. So it's not like he's had a free run, that he's a darling. They tend to demonize him for some understandable reasons. But he's deliberately tried to avoid conflict with Israel because I think he knows that they have the power to, completely. They don't have the power to make things go right in Syria, but they certainly have the power to make things go wrong.
For him.
But for Syria generally, yeah. I mean, Israel's not shown itself particularly clever at building good relationships. Its key relationships with Egypt and Jordan have been vital to its sort of relative peace. But it could have been, should have been, and perhaps in the future should be more clever the way it engages with Lebanon, because having a peaceful Lebanon on its border is a great asset for Israel. And it needs to think more deeply about the way it engages with Syria and you don't have good options in Syria, but it's in Israel's interest to have peaceful relations with neighbors that are stable. And Israeli politics through the Knesset is against that sort of deeper reasoning. So you'll find conflicting voices in Israel from people who are deep in the intelligence apparatus or ex-intelligence leaders saying one thing, and current Israeli politicians saying another thing.
All right, Greg, I appreciate that. Look, I'm moving on now. As you said, there's hours in that conversation.
Yeah.
Wanting to get on to sort of Indonesia's to finish this off, where you are right now,
Sure. Yeah.
and just the changing political landscape of Indonesia. We've seen a dramatic rise in outputs in its regional development, in its ability to become essentially what it intends to be, which is a regional power. So I want to ask you how Indonesia's current sort of political setup under Subianto is regarding the role of Islam in its politics, secularism, and sort of how it balances this society.
Yeah, look, really good questions, Joel. Maybe we should do an, if you're interested, I'm certainly interested, do another episode on this topic itself, because we've only got a few minutes left. I've got to catch the train, unfortunately.
Oh, sorry about
But long story short, Indonesia remains a functioning democracy. In some key areas, it seems less liberal and less open than it used to be, and that concerns people. But big picture, it remains a functioning democracy. Indonesians strongly believe in the idea of democracy. They're not enamored by the parties they have. And the political parties in the Indonesian political system don't follow clear sort of ideological convictions, apart from a handful of Islamist parties that are perhaps more consistent. So they are cynical about parties and politicians, but they do believe in democracy. For various reasons, Jokowi was very popular, the former president, and he transferred some of that popularity to Prabowo, who won with a really strong mandate. I mean, when you get 60% of the vote or near on it, that's in a two-party sort of contest. That's a pretty strong outcome. People have been disappointed this year since he came to power, the end of last year, that there's various criticisms of economic management, including there's budgetary cuts all around at the moment. Some of them perhaps make a lot of sense. He's got some pet projects, including a free lunch program at schools, which has merits, but I mean, the nutrition challenge in Indonesia needs to start with kids before they get to school to stop infant stunting. But that's a broader picture. But I mean, I think the idea that focusing on nutrition is a good idea. Some of the criticisms relate to the fact that Prabowo is a retired general, and he's much more patient and indulgent of serving generals than other leaders. And partly that's because Indonesia has a bloated general staff. I mean, it has many more generals and other flag officers than it has military positions for. So Prabowo's idea of opening up areas in civil bureaucracy, I think, is less about military takeover and more about providing opportunities for his community who through structural reasons, are sort of larger and less efficient than they should be, but are looking for ways of having meaningful posts. The role of Islam is kind of even across Indonesian democracy. Is another long story. But parties haven't won and lost for the most part on the basis of their religious credentials. There's a particular party, the Prosperous Justice Party, PKS, that has campaigned on Islamist principles and has got a certain degree of the vote, but it's pretty clear they've reached a ceiling. So less than 10% of the population is going to be easily swayed by those arguments. Most people want a government and parties and leaders that respect religion, but don't thrust it down your throat and don't tell you how to live your own life. So it's a really complex interplay. There's another long story, has a positive story about the way in which, out of the Indonesian police after the Bali bombing of 2002, a specialist counter-terrorism force was stood up out of a fairly corrupt and dysfunctional police force, and has been remarkably effective. And part of its achievements have been the willingness to engage empathetically and with some respect with the social networks from which extremists have come, and then use persuasion to turn people away, or at least cooperate on not supporting violent extremism. But that's another whole story in itself. It's a very interesting story, I think, and it does interplay with the nature of Indonesian democracy, because we have stable democracy in Indonesia. They've had such success in dealing with terrorism. But I've got to apologize and run for my train, Joel. I'm sorry.
No problem. Well, Greg had to leave us because he had a meeting with the ambassador where he had to get a high-speed train in to meet, which is fair enough. And sitting here in the Bogan garage, I think our priorities come into play. I did want to speak to Greg a little bit more about some of these issues, and also how they contrast with our relationship between Indonesia, the country he's in, and our nation. One thing I've asked him was about the recent killing of Dr. Marwan Sultan, at the Indonesian hospital in Gaza. Him and his entire family were destroyed, and he was one of the chief executives at this hospital. I would have liked to have asked him about the contrast between Indonesia's relationship with the Palestinians, its critical relationship with Israel that echoes through the region in our Southeast Asian neighbors, and how that might contrast with Australia's current position around AUKUS, around Washington, and around its relationship with its friend Israel. As the Australian government has been asking questions, making statements akin to the fact that Israel has a right to defend itself. Countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and others in the region are asking questions like, when does this stop? They're taking actions to pressure Israel on the international stage to stop its genocide. And Australia's role, speaking to Greg about matters of extremism, is its position is extreme at the moment. Because any kind of obfuscation or covering for this 600 plus day genocide is extreme. And as we reach out and as our Prime Minister visits Indonesia again, it's on his first port of call after winning his second election, we wonder how much this position is lip service. As it feels like in Canberra, the Richard Marles side of the government looks into another hemisphere before it even sees the large and important and dynamic, reasonably peaceful region that we live in, Asia. And Greg would have been able to provide a little bit of insight into the resting state of our two societies and how these two perceptions of this once in a lifetime massacre may be impinging on Australia's ability to achieve its national interest in the region to its own detriment. Greg also spoke about how groups in Iran and Pakistan might use these proxy forces to achieve political outcomes, yet was reticent to explore that right now we're seeing these proxy groups being used by the West to achieve kinetic political outcomes, whether they be targeted extrajudicial killings, deep intelligence operations undertaken by diaspora, or red wedding diplomacy that confuses, confounds, breaks with Westphalian tradition and pushes a new form of diplomacy where you invite someone in and smack them on the head with a big stick. These are extreme positions that the West imposes as it seeks to maintain hegemony. So as we do see groups that were once enemies of the West being legitimized into the saviors of Syria, we see a old familiar formula that is less connected and associated with the rogue governments that the West perceives, and more associated with the operational standards of Western power projection around the world. Greg has agreed to come on again sometime soon to have a chat, and we probably steer it towards a more Indonesia related discussion. And I appreciate him coming on to have a more difficult conversation with me regarding our perceptions of some of these power struggles at play and the orthodoxies versus the emerging realities that are perceived differently. Thanks for joining us today, and I hope to see you soon.